Okay, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Post-Impressionism. I've said this before, but whenever you see post in front of a term in art history, you know you have entered into fudge territory. It means we don't really know what to call it. The only thing we can say for certain is that it is post, that it is after Impressionism, and it's a perfect description. Before this, we have styles or movements that are easily recognizable or identifiable by their technique, their style, their subject matter, what have you. But you can't do that anymore after Post-Impressionism. The only thing you can say is it's after Impressionism. It isn't unified by style. Some artists will go back to a classical academic style. Some artists will go in a completely abstract direction. It isn't unified by theme. Some artists are still representing narrative and symbolism and meaning. Others have gone to pure expression. There's really no unifying force under the collection of styles and techniques that emerge in the wake of the collapse of Impressionism at the end of the 1880s. And this is one of the things that makes this definitively modern art, that we're finally moving into an era that we can say is modern. That is, it is moved away from classical subject matter. Modernism is the deconstruction of the academic style. So we used to have kind of moldy oldies, classical subject matter, Christian theme, and we're going to move away from that to contemporary subject matter. We're going to move away from academic illusionism and naturalism to abstraction and experiments in styles. We're going to move away from the idea of the painting as this magic window that opens up a vista to you to a painting that is surface, that is meant to be read as a painting. All of those things are very clear in Post-Impressionism. And so while there is a debate about which style is the first modern style, is it realism, is it Impressionism, nobody doubts that Post-Impressionism, we are definitely into the realm of modernism, and we're only going to get more experimental after that. And so we're going to see a proliferation of styles. It's not just going to be one style anymore, or one movement, or one idea. We are approaching a true democratization of art, where it is motivated purely by the artist and the market. Whatever the market can bear, whatever people can buy, and whatever they can sell will become the determination of where the art market is going to go and where the artists go. And so it's not a client or a patron relationship anymore. It's going to be organized and kind of controlled by the artists who are making this movement happen. It's also important to know this is an extraordinarily political age, and it increases as we get into the early 20th century. We're not going to quite get into the 20th century in this lecture. Next lecture, we're going to go full on into the 20th century, and oh my gosh, it will just be dizzying. There's going to be so many different movements and isms. You can't keep track of it all. Fortunately, I have a little timeline that will help you understand how it kind of overlaps, but we're not quite there yet. So let's talk about Post-Impressionism. Just to back up to show you where we were. Remember, 1874 we have the first Impressionist exposition. That happens and we have art that looks like this. Art that is very loose in brushstroke. It was very radical for the time. But it's still trying to capture that optical veracity, that impression of nature. And yet, within 12 short years, this is what's popping up at the exhibition, at the 8th and last Impressionist exhibition. This thing. Now, this thing we'll talk more in detail about, but this is not trying to capture an optical veracity of nature. It is obviously a construct. It is intentionally fake. It tries to, highlight its fakeness with you. It is a construction. That tree doesn't look like a tree. It looks like a swarm of bees. This is something that is given over to the style. And you can see this dramatic change. This first wave of Post-Impressionists we often call Neo-Impressionism. This was the Neo-Impressionists. It just means new Impressionists who were thinking about how do we create an impression in a new way. And you can see this radical change In Pissarro, this was the painting that the mythical Monsieur Vincent said was looked like he needed to wipe the dirt off his glasses before he did it. But here you can see he's genuinely trying to capture the impression of a landscape. But Pissarro by the 1880s is painting like this. Notice how everything is moving. Notice how every single thing has been divided up into a dot. And that's because he himself was impressed by this new generation of Neo-Impressionist painters that dominated the last Impressionist salons. The last Impressionist salon shows a clear break with Impressionism and a move into something else, something new. So let's talk about these guys. One of the first and foremost of these is Seurat. Georges Seurat is an interesting painter, and he is a French Neo-Impressionist. Clearly he was in the camp of the Impressionists, he is influenced by them, but he pushes it even further. He develops a technique that we call Divisionism. That is, you break everything down into tiny little pieces. He called it chromoluminarism, but we more commonly know it as Pointulism. Pointulism is where every single thing is made up of a series of tiny little dots. And these dots are all different colors that fuse together to create new colors. And this is in large part inspired by the work of Michel Eugène Chevreul. Chevreul was a chemist and a teacher who wrote a book, The Principles of Harmony and Contrast of Colors, where he basically argued that, color is perceptual. Rather than color being real or actual, it's perceptual. And if you take two colors that are very different next to each other, and you back away far enough, those colors engage in what's known as simultaneous contrast. And that means they will produce a third color, or a unique color. And in fact, this is a very important scientific discovery because this is what gives way to all modern printing. If you've ever seen printing, printing is done with just 4 colors. Modern printing is CMYK, which is cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. K took me the longest time to figure this out, but the reason black is K is because K stands for key, or the key color. And with just those 4 colors, you can mix dots in the right proportion to produce millions of potential colors. It's the same thing on a television screen or your monitor. Your monitor only really produces 3 colors, red, green, and blue. But those red, green, and blue dots blend together to produce the millions of colors that you see on your handheld devices, your screens, etc., everything else. That's all you need. And so from very simple colors, a lot of complex colors can be developed. So he was fascinated by this kind of scientific understanding of color, and he sought to reproduce it in his paintings. You can see in some of his earlier works, he is moving in this direction, but he's still painting in what would be regarded as an Impressionist style. His color patches are very, very small. They're very, very teeny, but they're still color patches. You can actually see his brushwork here. If you look down in the details, you can see that his brushstroke here is directional to indicate the grass. It's horizontal here to indicate the water and the movement of the water. It's little patchy stuff to indicate the clouds. There's a variety of different stroked widths and sizes. They're much smaller than something that had been used by a Pissarro before this, or a Monet or a Renoir. But there's still a kind of color patch. But you can see that his strokes are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and he's beginning to experiment. And that's where he really crosses over into his Divisionist technique. And here in his Divisionist technique, you can see this entire thing is made up of largely uniform dots. There's no sense of brushstrokes in this. In fact, people look at this and they say it's bizarre. It looks like a print. It doesn't look like a painting. Everything is made of tiny little dots, and this does some strange things. Like I said, it transforms this tree into something like a swarm of bees. It also gives an artificial quality to the picture. Nothing is dimensional. Everything feels kind of flat and plastic. This woman's dress in the center is reduced to a cylinder. It's the kind of painting that you can't even really appreciate until you get very close to it, When you get very close, you can see the numerous, just millions of tiny little dots necessary to make up this technique. If we go back and if we look right at the boundary layer of the shadow of the oak across the grass, it looks like we're essentially dealing in two more or less uniform colors. But if you zoom in on that section, holy cow, what a difference does that make? You can tell that in the dark green there is red and blue and purple, all combining together to give the impression of green. Likewise, in the light green we have a darker green, but we also have highlights of orange and yellow and white. Backing up again, taking a look at that from a distance, it doesn't seem to have that kind of complexity. It reads as more or less a kind of uniform surface. It kind of dazzled. It has a little energy around the edge, almost like snow in a television screen. If anybody remembers snow anymore, I guess there's horror movies, so that's why we remember snow on a television screen, because everybody's gone to digital screens. There's no snow on digital screens, but on the old screens you can see snow, and it gives it this pixelization, this kind of energy, and that kind of vibrancy comes through. You can see this in his paintings. This painting really was an incredible painting, so much so that you can see that he includes Le Grand Jatte in the background of this other painting with his models. What this does for the painting as a whole is rather remarkable. It moves it out of the category of the real, honestly. It doesn't feel like an Impressionist painting where a person is painting en plein air, trying to capture the moment. And in fact, he wasn't working en plein air. Seurat worked in a studio. He would go out and make sketches en plein air, but he would come back to the studio to finish these paintings. So the great revolution of the landscape painters and the Impressionists, where they took their painting outside and painted directly from life, is no longer necessary, because he's not trying to convey life. He's trying to convey something else. It's such an interesting scene, and not just because this woman has a pet monkey, which is fabulous. It's that in addition to it feeling kind of unreal, kind of plastic, notice that the figures don't really engage with each other. They all stare off in directions. You only have this really girl here who indicates any kind of movement at all. Everyone is noticeably still. There is a kind of alienation of the figures, even though they're all out there. They're all out there enjoying a Sunday afternoon in this park. They're there to see and be seen and to enjoy it, and yet it feels strangely remote, oddly distant. There's a kind of social commentary going on here. If you've ever seen Sunday in the Park with George, the Stephen Sondheim musical, it's based on this painting, and it depicts these people living lives of quiet desperation, kind of in isolation from each other. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that Stephen Sondheim nailed it, that is what is trying to be conveyed. Here are a group of people who are all together, yet somehow still alone. It's interesting. It does have this artificiality and coldness, unlike other things that we've seen before. And all of his paintings have this. There is a characteristic kind of alienation or detachment. Here we have this circus sideshow, and in the circus sideshow we have a band playing in the background. A trombone player is up front, but he has these impossibly skinny ankles. The figures are far more stylized. They're not realistic figures in any way. They are prototypes or archetypes of figures. They are constructions. The artificiality has been elevated. And that's the thing about post-impressionist painting. Photography took over the role of naturalism. Impressionism was a bold effort to kind of capture naturalism in a new and fresh way and technique, but ultimately they decided that's not what painting is for. Painting is to express the internal, not to record the external, and this is what this is. It's an expression of the internal. You can see a little bit more how all of this comes together in this wonderful series of dots. The technique distances you from the subject in a way and becomes increasingly more artificial. You can see that in one of his last works. Alas, Seurat, who became one of the more influential painters of the end of the 19th century, himself died very young. And as he died, a lot of his works were unfinished. But when you look at this composition, notice how the figures are perfectly perpendicular to the picture plane. They stand up rigid, and they sit down, I guess, but their bodies are rigid and perpendicular to the picture plane. They're utterly flat in the background. We have a lack of depth. Instead, what we have is something that feels very much like a cardboard cutout. He is moving away from reality. One of the other painters that was active there at the last 8th Impressionist exposition was the French Neo-Impressionist Sunyac. Paul Sunyac was, again, a Divisionist. He had a close partnership with Seurat until his sudden death in 1891. He actually went to the 5th Impressionist exhibition as an attendee and was deeply impressed by Claude Monet's work and decided, this is where I'm going to go. And he was actually working on a variety of sketches. An unfriendly Paul Gauguin kind of came up to him and saw him copying one of the painters, and he says, "We do not copy here, sir," which was a great suggestion that, was a great inspiration to him, that you don't learn by copying past masters, you learn by innovating. Okay, and so he started working almost on this kind of scientific understanding of imagery, breaking down the figures into tiny little dots to create sensations of color and movement. What I like is that towards the end of his career, he utterly abandoned the need to kind of depict anything real at all. And this is when the titles start to get really pompous. This is Opus 217, Against the Enamel of a Background Rhythmic with Beats and Angles, Tones and Tints, Portrait of Monsieur Félix Fénelon in 1890. You gotta love that title. What is this background? It's a complete acid trip. It is literally what he says it is. It's a rhythmic background with beats and angles. It doesn't exist for any purpose. You can see this move towards the fake. You can see this movement towards the intentional construction. And we start to call this move symbolism. That is, the goal is no longer to create or recreate nature or to create narrative. And if we do create a narrative, the narrative may be twisted, and in fact we wish it to mean something else. It's about reinterpretation and assimilation and adaptation. And so here he is creating a kind of symbolic portrait of Monsieur Fénelon. And it's very different and quite eclectic. We'll talk more about this in a bit. One of the next great post-impressionist painters would be Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec is such an interesting character. First of all, he suffered from a disease, and so he was born deformed, which meant that his legs never fully developed. So he had a full-length torso, but very short legs. And that meant that he never got taller than 4'8". So, I mean, I've talked about my apprehension about my frame here, so let's just say he wouldn't intimidate me. I'm short, but I'm not that short. But he was an interesting character because he was actually nobility. This is something many people don't know about him. He was actually next in line to be a count, and would have inherited the title from his father had he not died young and before his father. So what's interesting is he actually came from money. Another one of these bohemian characters who decides to slum it, comes from money, but decides he wants to live on his own. What's interesting is he actually could. He was one of the few artists that was very, very successful in his lifetime, but he was not successful so much for his paintings, but for his graphic design and his posters. So we'll talk about those. He was one of the innovators of what would become Art Nouveau. It wasn't really necessarily called Art Nouveau at the time he was doing it. And he made a career of creating posters for very famous performers in cabarets and nightclubs that existed at the time. The most famous, of course, being Jane Aufriel. He did lots of posters of her. And in fact, she gave him credit for his fame. She said, you know, she was no slouch herself, but she said, without the posters, no one would have ever known for me. And he gave credit to him. So this is one of the most famous posters that shows her as part of this cabaret. And you have to love that he has turned the head of the conductor here and the musician holding the upright on what I assume is a bass, instrument, bass-stringed instrument, and yet he has wrapped that around and turned that into the border. All of this is done by hand. He did this by hand. These were turned into lithographs, and they were mass-produced. And he had so much work as a person making posters and graphic design that he actually had a very substantial income from it, and that allowed him to explore time in painting. So it's funny, came from money, but he didn't need it. He actually was very successful. People always comment how wonderful these are. They're very simple. They're very flat. Again, there's probably the inspiration of Japanese art as well, and Japanese printmaking. Beautiful, just loose, but also still very evocative, handwritten text and hand lettering. We have this wonderful kind of figure here who's almost cut off at the head with the long black gloves. Elegant figures here. There in attendance with the musicians at the stage. You have to love the Dutch angles. Dutch angles means these crazy tilted angles. That's a term from film studies. From cinema, where you would tilt the angle to create anxiety in a film. But he was doing that in print. Great stuff, gorgeous stuff. But I love his paintings best of all. I think his paintings are just fabulous. His paintings, again, have much of the same emphasis. There's more emphasis on line. So unlike the Impressionists and the Neo-Impressionists were breaking everything into a divisionist technique, he instead brings his graphic design knowledge into this and re-emphasizes the line. You can see that almost all of his figures are outlined in either a dark outline or a heavy line or bead of paint. Yeah, there's some of that divisionist impressionism going on in the details and in this woman's fur ruff and her hat, etc. But compare that, to the outline, even the outline of the shadows, which is just kind of treated like a graphic element, the outline of the figures. My favorite part of this whole thing is trying to make sense of this guy's leg. We have two dancers, and he's trying to show the quickness of the foot movements, and yet it looks like the man's had a horrible accident. His legs bend, his knees bend in the opposite direction, or he has a bend in the middle of his shin that's impossible. Creating a kind of sense of the movement. Where is his foot at any one time? I also love that there's almost a capricious use of color, that some figures are pale and flesh tone, others are ruddy, others are blue. He doesn't seem to be consistent. He follows the color that has the inspiration. This character and his mustache is kind of a gray-green, whereas this guy with his nose up in the air is blue, almost as if he's a blue blood. You can especially see that in these works. Some of this is coming from the gaslighting. Again, gaslight creates this upward light that has this flickering quality, and he would capture that same kind of quality that we saw in the work of Degas. And the figures are often grotesquely caricatured, with their noses far forward or their chins exaggerated. That's all, again, part of this design. This shows him and a coterie of friends gathered together at a cafe, and we see, bright whites on the table, but deep purples, greens, and golds. Again, arbitrary color that evokes emotion for the sense of it. And again, outlines, linear qualities, excellent compositional strength. If there is one of these painters of the postmodernist period that's regarded as the father of modernism, it's got to be Paul Cézanne. So Paul Cézanne exhibited in the first and the third Impressionist expositions. He was an Impressionist, but very quickly tired of it, like many of them did, and he's not really known for his Impressionist era pieces. He is active in Paris, but he's interesting in that he's one of the first artists to go outside of Paris, to actually retreat to southern France, to the Provence, and paint almost entirely from there. He becomes one of the first to actually attract the attention of Ambrose Velard. Ambrose Velard would become one of the greatest art dealers of the late 19th and early 20th century. It was critical to the advance of the Fauvists and also to the Cubists, and he became part of that avant-garde movement. He starts off in the 1860s still trying to do classical themes. This is his take on the abduction of Persephone, with you have the god abducting the other, the goddess of, the daughter of the goddess of nature. And you can see the energy that exists here. This is before the Impressionists. Notice the palette is very dark. When he exhibited with the Impressionists, this is one of the paintings he exhibited, you can see that he gets loose. This one is a modern Olympia, which is a funny story. It very closely relates to Manet's Olympia. In this case, we have a woman that is being unveiled, if you will. A blanket or a sheet is being pulled off to display her. And this, of course, is a client. This is a bordello, a brothel, if you will. And so they have updated the old iconography, but with prostitutes. But notice how loose and how flat it is. Right away, you can see that he was moving in a direction away from trying to capture naturalism, and he wasn't all that committed to capturing naturalism to begin with, and more into the technique and the quality of the paint. One of the things that's said about Cézanne is that he said something to the effect that, anyone could shock the world with a nude. He wanted to shock the world with an apple. That he didn't want it to be the subject matter that was so shocking, as in Manet's early pieces. He wanted it to be the technique that was shocking. And so you can see him copying Impressionists, pushing the boundaries, making these clouds more overt, making them flatter, more dynamic, becoming shapes in their own right. And it's at the end of the 1870s and into the 1880s that he really begins to push this further with what would be a very traditional subject matter, still life. Still life, again, was one of these traditional subject matters. It was one of the lower genres in the hierarchy of painting, something that you painted to demonstrate your skill to clients, etc., but not something that was considered high art. So going back to a still life, in a way, was much like a Renoir going back to classical nudes. The subject matter doesn't matter. What matters is the painting. It's the surface. It's the technique that matters. So screw the subject matter. We'll just paint whatever. And he just painted whatever he happened to have around him, which in this case is going to wind up being still life with jar, cup, and apples. And right away you can see something's going on here. Notice the jar. Well, okay, if you actually drew a jar or a cup like that, you'd probably be flunked out of your first, your freshman drawing class. Notice that if you know anything about jars, and then, this is terrible, but the top of a jar is essentially an ellipse. But notice this is more rounded on the top and flatter on the bottom. Same here. So his ellipses don't really work. Same thing here for the kind of contour of these things. His ellipses are off. His perspective is off. Same thing with the folds in the fabric. This thing seems really chunky in places and not terribly flat in others. The wallpaper pattern back here seems almost as far forward in the scene as the apples themselves. The apples are kind of dimensionless. They have a gesture toward shade, but they just kind of become circles of color. You can see this even more pronounced in this one, Still Life with Fruit Dish. Look how flat that glass is. Is this the leading edge of the glass, or is that the leading edge? Is this above our eyesight? I mean, generally, if you have a single, sight line, these ellipses will get more wide and open the closer you are to the top or the bottom. They get flatter the closer you are to the horizon line. Oh, that's a terrible diagram, but you get the idea. But notice that, we have an ellipse here. Where is this thing? How does this sight line, is this the horizon line? It just doesn't work. He doesn't care. Same thing, the background here is as real and as solid as the actual glass is supposed to be. Then you gotta love this bowl. The base is right there. The bowl is right there. So the center of the bowl is there. Boy, did you get this secondhand? How is this thing even standing? It's so off balance, it should fall down. Again, he doesn't care. It's not the point. He doesn't care to actually get details like this accurate. He's not painting nature. He's painting paint. He's putting down paint. And you can see that in the apples, that essentially he's just traced the simplest of form and given it a gesture and created something that is entirely made out of a series of strokes. The strokes themselves kind of become entities in the page. And you can see this in his paintings, even when he's doing, again, another still life. This is Plaster Cupid. Well, okay, so this is a table. Is this the floor? But the floor looks like it's tilted up. Is this apple on the edge of a table, or is it on a floor, behind it? How can you tell? I love that the paintings, which are stacked against the wall in the background, don't obey any laws of known physics. And, the apple, this apple here is an apple on a painting in a painting. But it looks just as real and three-dimensional as this apple does. There's no sense that, something is more real than the other. He is using the objects in front of him to give him a springboard, an inspiration to work from, but that's all it is. He doesn't care if he gets it right or not. He's deconstructing these shapes as he goes. One of my favorite examples that shows this is his many, many paintings of Mount Saint-Victoire. Saint-Victoire was a very prominent mountain down there in Provence, and he painted it. I think there's a legend that said that he believed that if he painted enough, God would give him the mountain. But that may be apocryphal, but that's something I've heard. So there's this characteristic shape of the mountain that exists. This is what the mountain actually looks like, and you can see it's reasonably faithful to the mountain itself. But when we look at the depiction, most of this is given over to the foreground and the branches. But you notice what's going on here? I mean, if this was a realistic painting, one of these branches would cross over the top of the mountain, but they don't. They respect the kind of boundary of the mountain. They fill in the space outside of the mountain, almost as if they exist on the same plane. Same thing with these houses and features in the background. You kind of have an aqueduct or a bridge back here and a house here, but only just gestures. It gets even more pronounced as we move into his works into the early 20th century. One of my all-time favorite paintings. I love this thing. I spent hours in front of it in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I used to live in Philadelphia and took students through there all the time. It's my favorite museum to teach modern art because it has the best linear narrative. What I mean by that is that if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the way they've organized their modern galleries, although they've completely redone them, moved them to the Met Brewer for a while, which was the old Whitney. The Whitney has a new building, and then moved them back. And I understand they've been completely redone, but they were really terrible. They were hodgepodge, hit and miss. They never had any of their best and brightest on display. But you could go from gallery to gallery in the Philadelphia Museum. I don't know, maybe you can't anymore. It's been years. But you could go from gallery to gallery, and you could see the progression of modern art. It was one of the best museums to teach from. Anyhow, I would always stop students in front of this one because I wanted them to see this painting. You have a little bit of a gesture of perspective and shape. I mean, these are roofs to houses, but it just disintegrates by the time you get to the mountain itself. Is this a roof? Is this a house? Is this a cypress tree or a shadow? What's going on? It ceases to be anything at all, and it becomes an abstraction. He has completely deconstructed the shapes, and the sky is as solid an object as the mountain itself. In fact, it almost feels as present as the mountain. What you end up having is a kind of, recognizable surface that doesn't have any real depth. There's no real depth, there's just motion and shape. He did another version of this. This one's in the Pushkin Museum. Very, very similar idea. And he even did this with figures, pushing human figures. This is his wife. Notice the hands are just dissolve into nothingness. This one is one of my favorites. This is a portrait of a peasant, someone that he knew there in the south of France. And yeah, we get a sense of a ledge and a person in a chair, but the face has been totally deconstructed. We can see this at work here in perhaps one of his most famous paintings, The Large Bathers, which too is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Gigantic painting. But such a confusing painting. The subject matter is, of course, women out in the landscape bathing, as they do. Not sure if this was ever a practice of women, but it was an imagined thing, large nudes in a landscape. That's just art history for you. That's the kind of crappy definition of art history, is I explain pictures of naked people to total strangers, but there you go. So you have all of these naked women in a landscape bathing, but really it's not about the women or the landscape. In fact, it's very hard to tell where the landscape ends and the women begin. You have this very strong triangular kind of pyramidal composition, but notice that this tree just runs right into the head of this individual. Whatever background is here, there's only a gesture to a kind of depth. It gets even worse when we get to the foreground. Notice that none of them seem finished. There's no detail to their hands. There's just a gesture in their faces. And then there's this scene. What is going on over here? You have a head and then an arm. Is this the backside of the woman in back, or is it the shoulder and the arm of the woman in front? And the answer is, who knows? And the better answer is, no one cares. That's really the reality here, is that you have, Cézanne has just given up on the need for delineating these things or for representation. He has broken down these into complete abstractions. And most people then put Cézanne at the mark between moving from figurative representation towards abstraction. Many artists give him the credit for this intuitive leap that eventually will lead to full abstraction in modern art. In fact, you can see Maurice Denis painted this picture as an homage to Cézanne, and it's surrounded by many individuals who were, dedicated to Cézanne and famous painters at the time. The other great painter that pretty much broke the boundary between the depiction of the real and the surface would have to be Vincent van Gogh. So Vincent van Gogh is a Dutch painter. Now, I guess I could say Van Gogh, which is terrible sounding, but that's apparently the way it's supposed to be said in the Dutch. But he was active in France, and most know him as Van Gogh. So if you wonder why I say it that way, that's the way I say it. Every once in a while, people get precious about this, insist that you say it Van Gogh, but I'm not going to, because I want to, save my larynx. So I'm going to say Van Gogh, which is the way the French say it anyway. So. And he was active mostly in France anyhow, so that makes sense. So he was a Dutch painter. He was largely self-taught. He did have some training from his cousin, Anton Mauve, who had a studio. I think he was also, went to the studio of Fred Corman in Antwerp. But he mostly was entirely self-taught. And of course, he was originally from the Netherlands, which means he's looking at Netherlandish painting. So he's going to mimic the, art styles of Rembrandt, of Dutch painters who were known for a darker palette. Right away, though, you can see the kind of expressive brushstroke that he was making, the kind of simplicity. Some of his earlier works, you can see he hasn't yet fully transitioned into this love of color. This was the Potato Eaters, and it's very similar to kind of interior genre scenes out of the Dutch tradition. Here is a pair of shoes. Again, his palette is very dark. Even when he's painting things like, you know, landscapes or, you know, flowers, he remains very reserved, very dark, a kind of muddy palette. And then he takes a trip to Paris, and he saw some of the Impressionist works with their bright skies and full color palettes. He had a very close relationship to his brother Theo Van Gogh, who was something of an art dealer. And his brother and him had a long correspondence. It's how we know so much about the life of Van Gogh, is that his brother supported him and really believed in him, and they wrote back and forth to each other extensively. And this correspondence, you know, reveals this close relationship. So he comes to Paris and he sees the Impressionists, and pow, what an impact it has on him. Instantly you see this enormous shift in color. And also you see the use of the color patch. He just absolutely absorbs this and completely changes his style. And the bright, vibrant colors and the directional line that we associate with Van Gogh come to the fore. He also has something of a kind of transformation, at least in his work. Van Gogh is one of the most prolific artists of his generation. There's hardly anybody that comes close. I think he did over 800 paintings in his lifetime, over 1,200 works in print or pencil, and well over half of those 800 paintings he did in the last 2 years of his life. You know, you'd just be cranking out a painting a day. And so you can see this, the effect that this has. This is a wonderful example. This is a portrait of his friend and associate. And you could see the difference that happens in these 2 years. That in the previous years, he has some of that directional line, but he's still very much in the dark kind of Dutch palette. And then immediately he moves over to a bright, vibrant palette using paints directly out of the tube. And the line isn't just a color patch. It becomes a force of nature. It becomes something that guides the eye around the figure, giving contour and direction to the figure. We have these beautiful, again, Japanese prints here in the background that you can see that he has simplified, but they almost feel as present. It's this vibrant color and directional line that gives so much power to his work and incredible vitality. But again, not a representation of the external, more of a representation of the internal. One of my favorites is this, a portrait of a postman that he painted. And this one you can't appreciate fully until you see the detail of the face. All of this incredible, expressive line and bright, vivid color. The tactile quality of a Van Gogh is just unreal. You don't realize how three-dimensional they feel until you get close to them. Each brushstroke has a kind of presence and guides your eye and moves you through the piece. So it's at this time that he himself is struggling deeply. He struggled with mental illness. He also teams up with Paul Gauguin, which we'll talk about in a bit, and is active mostly in and around Saint-Rémy, Arles, in France. He actually suffers a nervous breakdown, commits himself to an asylum for a year, but keeps on painting. One of the things about being a painter is when you run out of stuff to paint, you can always paint yourself. And you can see the progress of his portraits. So these are portraits made in and around 1887, right when he makes this transformation to bright, vivid colors, and the experience of the Impressionists and the Neo-Impressionists, all of this bright, just quick brushwork, but it gets even more expressive. Notice what he starts doing with the line, that the line starts to convey not only form, but motion. As he gets to the last year of his life, you can see how the background here becomes a series of vibrant directional lines. A Van Gogh painting is never still for that reason. So, you can see that he's moving from an almost Impressionist or Neo-Impressionist approach to something quite different. something very vibrant. And of course, we have to mention the fact that he cut his ear off. The honest truth is that we don't know why he cut his ear off. He was suffering from mental illness. The story of him doing it and giving it as a gift or a token to a prostitute seems to be largely, kind of apocryphal. But there was recently a new paper I read that gave a new theory as to why he cut the ear off. But I actually think, discussing his mental illness is to misunderstand him. When you see his later works, the last 2 years of his life, he painted many sunflowers. This one's my favorite. Again, it's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'm biased. That's my museum. I'll always think of it as my museum. You can see how each thing is outlined. It gives this direction and form. He was inspired by Japanese art, and Japanese art had these beautiful byobu, or folding screens, that were often had gold leaf backgrounds and blue irises, and so he took that and used that color to express that quality. But the line and the form here, and it's reciprocated. Japanese love Van Gogh for his sense of design and quality. You can see that in his interior scenes. This is the very famous night cafe, where the light fully illuminates the underside of this canopy, and you get a sense of the motion of the light over the surface. I love the interior of the night cafe here, where you see radiating lines indicating the movement of the light. I actually need to use a different pen color to make that a bit clearer, but you can see the radiating lines. It's just incredible. And of course, here is a shadow, but the shadow has a luminosity that you wouldn't see in other paintings. This is the bedroom from the asylum where he was, kind of interred briefly. And we see also, likewise, a lack of a sense of perspective. That may be due to his Dutch heritage. The Dutch never really were as particular about perspective as the Italians were, or the French were. But either way, it gives this sense of this incredibly dynamic space. Here's a wonderful picture that almost reads like a self-portrait, where you have his chair with his pipe and his tobacco, and it's a very modest and humble chair, but the perspectives are all tilted up so that we can see the floor and the wall. Again, we're no longer looking at a dimensional object, we're looking at a painting. And perhaps, the best extension of that is going to be some of his most famous paintings, these endless swirls of light. As I'm fond of saying, night skies don't look like this unless you've dropped acid. He was not trying to communicate what he actually saw with his eyes. He was trying to communicate the sensation of motion that what he saw with his eyes gave him. And you can see this not just in this famous example, but also in the wheat field with cypress, which seems to undulate and just be alive with color and life. Many people have speculated that he suffered from some form of temporal lobe epilepsy. This can create hallucinations and create sensations of movement and ecstasy, and that this was probably what he was experiencing in this painting. I don't like those kind of stories. First of all, there's no real evidence that he had epilepsy. He did have mental illness, but no one has any real kind of concrete evidence that he had temporal lobe epilepsy or that he had hallucinations. You have to kind of read between the lines of his writings to get a sense of that. And I think it also, when you come up with kind of just so stories like that, they diminish the quality of his work and diminish the capacity of his genius. Plus, it doesn't really fit the narrative. He doesn't start painting like this until he sees the Impressionists and the Neo-Impressionists. And it's obvious that he has built incrementally. You can see a progression in his work. One would assume that if this is the product of a mental illness or some kind of mental problem or medical condition, it would be spontaneous and not have an evolutionary history. I think the evidence is rather that he was a genius, that he knew what he was doing and moving in that direction. Famously only sold one painting during his lifetime, but he was just starting to get recognition when he died. He regrettably killed himself, shot himself with a gun, and in the chest, and actually had time to send a telegram to his brother, who came and was by him by his deathside, by his deathbed. It took him more than a day to die, and so he passed away. And kind of tragically, Theo Van Gogh passed away not long after. And so it's actually Theo Van Gogh's wife, his widow, that inherited the corpus of Vincent's paintings. And she was the one that saw the real genius in them and worked tirelessly to elevate these paintings. And so Van Gogh, when he died, was not terribly known, but within 10 years, his stuff was very well known, particularly amongst the Expressionists, the German Expressionists, and the Fauvists who were influenced by his work. Which takes us to Paul Gauguin. So Paul Gauguin was, again, another French painter. He was active in Paris, Brittany, and French Polynesia. He worked with Van Gogh, and he's important for pioneering a couple of things. One of my favorite quotes by him is that the history of modern art is also the history of the progressive loss of art's audience. Art has increasingly become the concern of the artist and the bafflement of the public. And what he meant by that is that art, at least in the academic style, was always very much about mass communication, whereas clearly art had moved in the direction of personal expression. He started out himself very much painting in an Impressionist style, but he was quickly captivated by this concept of the primitive, and he's one of the pioneers of Primitivism in art. He himself was a devout Catholic and was sincerely looking for spiritual experiences. And going all the way back to Rousseau and a French Enlightenment thinker in the 18th century, there was this sensation that modern man had lost a connection to the spiritual, and to reconnect with the spiritual, we needed to get back to a primitive state, the so-called noble savage. And so he went looking for people that had this quality, and he thought he found them in the Bretons. The Bretons were a religious minority that lived in Brittany, this peninsula on the coast of France. This is a gross miscaricature, or overgeneralization. But if I had to describe them briefly in a nutshell, you could imagine these as Amish. They were like, Amish in America live a very primitive lifestyle. They're religious conservatives or fundamentalists, but they live a very simple lifestyle. And that's a gross oversimplification, but that's the way you might be able to understand the Bretons and what they meant to him. And so he started painting them in their lives, hoping that he could find some of this innate spirituality and primitivism that he was looking for. He was trying to find something authentic. It's at this time that he also pairs with Van Gogh. Van Gogh himself was active all around the south of France, and so that made sense. Get out of Paris, get out of the corrupt city, and find someplace a little bit more, authentic. And here you have Gauguin painting Van Gogh, painting his very famous sunflowers. Amazing art historical document. Gauguin also painted the same night cafe that he painted. They hung out together. And his was, again, Madame Junot, who was a woman who was a proprietor at this location that both of them knew and both of them painted. So here's Gauguin's version of this, and there is Van Gogh's version of this. Increasingly, though, he kept trying to move into more direct spiritual subject matter, something that he felt had more spontaneity, more authentic spirituality. He has something of a falling out with Van Gogh, and he parts company with him. And he starts painting paintings kind of like this. Now, this is such an interesting painting. And the painting is Vision After the Sermon, Jacob wrestling with the angel. So we have a collection of Breton women here, and there is a Breton minister right there. And the implication here is that he has just finished giving a sermon. And the sermon that he has given is the famous story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. So long story short, in case you didn't get your Sunday school, Jacob wrestling the angel is a story that comes out of the book of Genesis in the Bible. Jacob goes off to find his wives and his fortunes, but he has stolen the birthright of his brother Esau, and now it's come time for him to come home, and he's very anxious about Esau and whether he will kill him. So he sends his entire family first with gifts to Esau, and he himself is left alone. And while he's left alone, he crosses the river into Canaan by himself. And as he crosses the river, an angel leaps out and just wrestles with him. And they wrestle all night long. The angel is specifically described as the angel of the Lord, so it's kind of unclear, is this an angel or is this a manifestation of God himself? Well, they wrestle all night long, and he manages to get the angel into a compromising kind of lock, but the angel touches the hollow of his thigh and shrivels his thigh. And the angel says, the morning has come, release me. And I don't know why he has to go in the morning. Maybe he's a vampire. But, Jacob says, I'm not going to do that unless you bless me. And he blesses him and gives him a new name. And the name that he gives him is Israel. And Israel means to struggle with God. It's just kind of one of these interesting things. And so that's why he gets that name, because he thinks, holy crap, I've just struggled with God. I've had this wrestling match with God. It's a very strange visionary moment in the Bible, but it's used as a moment of you challenging God and you and God coming to terms. It's kind of an interesting thing, and it's one of the things that recognizes that Israel is going to be the father of the 12 tribes and all the great kingdoms that are to come. He eventually crosses the river, meets Esau, and Esau and him are reconciled, and Esau doesn't require anything of him, and they're loving brothers again. So it's kind of a great story. So we have two scenes here that are kind of incongruous. On the one side, we have, that's obviously Jacob and the angel wrestling. But then we have these contemporary people here. And what are they doing? And it's a very mysterious thing. The grass, or the ground, is red. And again, grass don't grow that way. And the whole group of people are separated by this tree, which separates between the two of them. So what's going on? What we think's going on here is that this is a representation of a vision, that the minister has just finished teaching the story of this visionary experience about how all of us must come to terms with God, and that's what we seek. We struggle with God. We come to terms with it. And Gauguin seems to want to show that these people themselves are having a vision. So this is a vision of a vision. What's interesting is that most are in an attitude of prayer, but a few seem to be gazing into the vision directly. This is such an odd thing, but it gives us this spiritual sense that we too can have this kind of experience. We can struggle or meet God. He was very sincere in these kind of representations. This one is, again, another one of these visionary experiences. Here we have Christ on the cross, and we're not supposed to imagine that this is a statue of Christ on a cross with a bunch of Breton women kneeling around it. No. These are Breton women who are kneeling and praying, and they are having an actual vision of Christ on the cross. And this is a representation of a visionary experience. That's kind of why Christ is yellow, because he obviously is not of this world. This yellow color indicates this otherworldly quality of him. He meant these kind of paintings most sincerely, and he actually tried to donate this painting to a local church, which said, no thanks. It was a bit too much for them. And at that point, he kind of decided he'd had enough. He had tried to find spirituality amongst primitive populations in Europe and in France, and he said he was done. And so he convinced his wife to let him go to French Polynesia, to Tahiti. And so he did. And there he believed he found people who were primitive enough that they had this kind of true spirituality. And he recast the native Tahitians into his paintings. And of course, being French, he also developed mistresses among them. This young woman here was one of his Tahitian mistresses, but also one of his models. And so here she is displayed on the bed, again, almost in a classical art history sense, a classical nude, but very clearly a person of color being overlooked by a figure, kind of representing the spirit of her ancestors and these ancestral gods. He would eventually create this painting. This painting, Where Do We Come From, What Are We, Where Are We Going, shows an entire cycle of life, of people from birth to old age, with the gods overlooking and people reaching up. There are elements here which are clearly taken from Christianity, the taking of the fruit, the forbidden fruit, the moving out of the Garden of Eden, but also things that take from the native religion of the people of Tahiti. When this was created, this has often been regarded as his suicide note, that he was tired of the world and its kind of decadence, and so he was looking for this kind of spirituality. He did attempt suicide, but he was unsuccessful. So this deep spirituality, this emphasis on primitivism, all of these come together into a kind of new style that we call symbolism, where the technique is not what's important, it's what is represented that's important. It's this ability to communicate these internal dialogues, these complex internal dialogues. And so by the end of his career, he was clearly a symbolist, trying to compose stories and new narratives. There were many artists that were doing the same thing. Pierre Puvis de Chavannes was trying to do the same thing, but he was a muralist, and he would work instead with classical subject matter. That he would take figures that were very much borrowed from classical mythology and create classical ethereal figures that were meant to inspire. And these are interesting paintings because the Academy doesn't quite know how to take it. They are often very classical paintings. This is his painting, The Sacred Grove, beloved of the arts and the muses, which he did over a 5-year period, this large mural. And this was something that anyone in the academic world could clearly understand. You got people wearing togas, you've got nudes, you've got classical youths, there's even a Greek temple back there and figures floating in playing lyres. But there was also a sense that something was different, something was going on. When you look at these figures, they're not identified, they are not called out as specific muses. Instead, they tend to be kind of generic or abstract symbols. And that's what the symbolists were trying to do. They were recapitulating the past. They were reappropriating the past, but giving it new vitality. You can see this, I think, best in the works of Gustav Monroe. Gustav Monroe was famous for tackling these kind of subject matters. He often worked in an academic style, but his paintings were just a little bit off. And while he often did classical subject matter, he reinterpreted that classical subject matter so that it was no longer about the classical myth. It had some kind of psychosexual interpretation instead. The most famous example, of course, would be his Oedipus and the Sphinx. This one was painted in 1864 and was praised at the time. It clearly has the qualities that an academic painter would look for, that it has this wonderful polish, classical subject matter, but the more you looked at it, the stranger it became. Usually, in the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx, the Oedipus and the Sphinx would be separated. Instead, the Sphinx claws onto his body, and it's impossible to ignore the sexual tension between them. The story of Oedipus, of course, is this story where Oedipus goes to the oracle at Delphi. He's this Greek prince, and the oracle at Delphi tells him, he says, "I'm sorry, but you're going to kill your father and marry your mother." And he says, I can't have that happen. So he decides to travel to a far country where he kills a stranger on a roadside, and then he comes across a town that has been plagued by a Sphinx and unfortunately has had their king killed, so he can't help them. So they say, if you kill this Sphinx and divine the riddle of the Sphinx and kill it, then you can marry our beautiful queen, who is now without a husband because somebody killed him on the roadside. And he does all this, and of course, you know the end of the story. It turned out the parents that he thought were his parents were not his. They were his adopted parents, and the man he killed on the roadside was his father, the king, and the woman he ends up marrying for killing the Sphinx ends up being his mother. So it's this story of incest and intrigue and twisted fates that you can't escape. But Moreau seems to have loaded it up with intense, overwhelming sexual tension and made it more about the idea of the psychosexual, and then made it about the story of the mythology. He does this a lot. He reinterprets stories to make them intentionally ambiguous, to take on new meanings. And I think you can see this especially in this painting. This is The Apparition. Now this one is the story of Salome. Salome is the daughter of Herodias, and this is a story that comes out of the New Testament. But it's also a wonderfully salacious story. Herod, who was a terrible human being, killed his brother so that he could marry his brother's wife, and John the Baptist condemned him for that. And so he doesn't like that, he being king. He doesn't like some crusty old prophet in robes and animal skins, saying he's condemned. So he has him shut up in prison. But his wife, Herodias, wants him dead. But Herod is too afraid to kill him because the people regard John the Baptist as a prophet. And so instead, Herodias hatches a genius plan. She gets her daughter to dance for her husband and basically prostitutes her daughter out there. So she does. She dances for Herod, and Herod desires her and promises her anything. And of course, her mother had put it into her. Says, when he, says, whatever you want, I'll give it to you, ask for the head of John the Baptist. And so he's stuck. He's made his oath, so he has to kill John the Baptist. So Herodias manages to get her wish and get the head of John the Baptist. What a lovely family. And you thought reality TV was bad. Oh my gosh. So all of that story is terrible and awful. And the story here is actually not a story that's found in the New Testament. It's an imaginary story that comes out of Moreau's grotesque but a fantastic imagination. Here we see Herod, who's an old, kind of doddering monarch. Herodias is beside him. And Salome is dancing here, but John the Baptist has already been killed. And as she dances, and you can see she has this very sensual body, she sees an apparition of the head. So she learns of her guilt. So it's almost like a ghost story where she has confronted with her guilt. And again, it has this very psychosexual kind of story. One of the things I love about Moreau is that his paintings are often just encrusted in detail. No painting gets more encrusted or more dense than this story. And this is where it's obvious that he no longer cares about the original intent of what the story is. He cares only about what he can do to show his symbolic content. So this is a wonderful story. This is Jupiter and Semele. Jupiter, or Zeus, the god of the Greeks, the king of the gods, was fond of sleeping with whatever human mortal he could, but he had to restrain himself and he could not show his full glory because it would destroy them. So he is there with one of his mortal lovers, Semele, and Hera puts it into her mind that, well, how do you know this guy is the king of the gods? How do you know that he's not just some ordinary dude? How do you know that he is really, the ruler of the gods? And she says, well, tell you what, ask him to show himself in all his glory, and that'll prove it. Well, of course, this is a terrible trap that Hera has set for Semele because she knows that if she does this, it will totally destroy her. So Semele asks for a wish from Jupiter, and that is, can you show me in all your glory? And Jupiter has to do it because an oath is an oath is an oath. But of course, he knows that this will mean her death. And this is where she dies, but a child is in her womb. This is Zeus's child. This is eventually going to be Dionysus, who is the god of wine, but also the god of nature and visions, and he snatches the child from the womb before it's destroyed, before Semele is incinerated, and stitches it up in his own thigh and gives birth to his own son. Yeah, Greek myth. Really weird stuff. So that's the story. So you're seeing the moment here where you can see that she is beginning to be burned. Jupiter is exposed in all his glory and wonder, and the painting just goes on in its detail. It never ends. And it becomes not so much a painting about this mythological story, but it becomes a painting of union with the divine. Everything is encrusted, and there's all kinds of alchemical elements and other things that are included here, till it becomes this psychological experiment. So the symbolists were all about, pushing the boundary of traditional subject matter and reinvigorating it and giving it new meaning. One of the more, imaginative ones would be Orion Rodol. Rodol was a French printer and printmaker and painter, and he was extraordinarily influential to the Surrealists because he would take concepts and create these bizarre surreal imagery before we even had the term Surrealism. This is Caliban, who comes from the Shakespeare play, The Tempest, and he is transformed into this bizarre giant-headed monster. One of my favorites, though, is this one. This painting also has one of the greatest titles ever. The eye, like a strange balloon, mounts toward infinity. Now, in the 1880s, this is long before powered flight, balloons were high-tech. Balloons were extraordinarily advanced, and they were kind of revolutionary in their ability to give us a perspective on the world. So he takes a modern thing, a balloon, and he combines it with an eye. Then he has this kind of strange figure down here. So how is the eye like a strange balloon? Again, he's crafting a symbol. Balloons were this new high technology. They gave us great knowledge, but they were entirely at the mercy of the wind, and they blew wherever the wind took them. And so the eye is like a balloon. It is at the mercy of the wind. But, like the balloon, it can take us to new heights that we'd never seen before. So the bizarre combination of a variety of forms creates new and wonderful imagery. And the symbolist imagery is often kind of sometimes sinister, sometimes macabre, sometimes dark or bizarre. It depends on occultic imagery. It was really interesting stuff. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, there's a whole series of vibrant movements that come about. One of the ones that we should talk about really quickly is the Nabi. The Nabi were called the prophets, and they were all people who came out of the Académie Julian, which was this art school, and they influenced Fauvism, Expressionism, and Surrealism. They had a number of members. Paul Cerizet was one of the chief members, and here he is painting a portrait of one of the other members, Paul Ronson, and he depicts him as a prophet. That's what Nabi means. It's a Hebrew word for prophet. And they really began to experiment with form. Ambrose Velard was creating these paintings where people just disappear into the wallpaper, where it all becomes patterning. Cerizet was one of the first to experiment with almost radical form, flat abstraction. What we are looking at here is a kind of shoreline and a reflection, an open sky, but you could be forgiven for just ignoring that entirely and just thinking of it as an abstract piece. So we do have these kind of radical figures pushing us in the direction of greater abstraction and greater experimentation. Likewise, we have a number of really radical groups forming elsewhere. There's this radical Belgian group that forms, and at the center of that is the Belgian symbolist and expressionist James Ensor. He was noted for painting these bizarre scenes. This one is the intrigue, and what's fascinating about it is all of these figures are wearing carnival masks. So carnival is the celebration that happens before Lent. So you have Ash Wednesday, the day before that is Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras, and Carnival is a thing where people would go to, get out their, their their anxieties before they had to start fasting and preparing for Easter and Lent and the 40 days of Lent. So it's basically your last day to party. And so carnival masks conceal a person's view. But what's interesting about these carnival masks is that some of them are recognizable masks, but some of them appear to be faces, and yet they are mask-like. This is an ordinary human face. Are these meant to be masks or human faces? Or is he saying something about human faces, that we wear masks? It has this deep symbolic content. Here's another example. This one I find really fun. This one is Christ's entry into Brussels. So here you have Christ riding on the donkey, and what's interesting is he imagines the second coming, but he imagines is what it would be like in the modern world. And of course, everybody is there. You have carnival celebrates wearing masks. You have a marching band, of course. You have politicians and clowns. Even the socialists and all the political parties are out in force. It becomes a carnival atmosphere. And of course, it reduces the second coming of Christ to something ludicrous. And again, a social commentary that exists. Edvard Munch, likewise, was one of these painters at the end of the 19th century that goes on to influence the Northern Expressionists. He's a Norwegian painter and printmaker, and a lot of these people dealt with issues of the macabre or the fantastic. This is a famous lithograph, and this one is called Madonna. Well, Madonna means the Virgin, and yet the Virgin is seen here like no other virgin. Her breasts are exposed, her body is pale and white. She seems to be in a state of ecstasy. Going around the border are a series of what can only be described as spermazoa, This is sperm finding its way to the egg. And then we have a strange, shriveled up fetus-like figure. Is this the Christ child? Christ was supposed to be a miraculous birth, and yet he's included the sperm here. The generation, is this a symbol for God's grace, or is this a kind of satirical take on Christ? It seems rooted in ideas of anxiety and blasphemy, and people didn't quite know how to take it. Of course, he's famous for painting one of the most enduring images of the era, the Scream. It's painted in 4 different copies. This one was done in a combination of oils and pastels. But we have this wild and lurid sky and landscape, all the directional line that we have used to seeing in Van Gogh, which gave it energy and dynamism. Here just gives it anxiety. Have this pale green figure ushering out a scream, and kind of threatening figures down at the end of what we presume is a dock into the sea. Again, moving away from any kind of intent to show the external and purely expressing the internal, the sense of anxiety and fear and dread. Painting has become incredibly experimental, incredibly, expressive, and moved away from any kind of idea of the narrative. It's all about expressing the internal. And then we have, a few other collections of individuals who are just oddballs, who lack formal training, but wind up being very influential. Henry Rousseau, who is very popular today, started as a customs officer and had no formal training, and started teaching himself at the age of 49. And he becomes a pioneer of Primitivism. Because he's self-taught, his works have a folk art quality, an unpolished quality. And he was someone who was later recognized by people like Picasso and Matisse as being a kind of innate, accidental genius. Picasso, came across one of his paintings and then held a banquet in his honor. And the banquet was half burlesque and half homage, and no one could even quite tell if Picasso even meant it sincerely or not, but he later said things very praising. He would love to paint these kind of exotic scenes in far-off lands that again have this dreamlike quality and this flat treatment. It brings this quality of primitivism, and primitivism, as pioneered by people like Gauguin and Rousseau, is going to have a huge impact on modernism going forward, again, because primitivism is seen as being more authentic, as being more genuine. And so by the time we reach the early 20th century, we're going to see an almost complete reversal of what we saw at the beginning of the 19th century. That is, that instead of this high academic style, where the painting is a magic window to a vista that has clear academic illusionism, instead the painting is a window into the soul. The painting is a window into the person's psyche, sometimes revealing some pretty weird crap, sometimes revealing nothing at all, but being a springboard into the surface so that the painting just reads as a surface. And all of these characteristics come together. So by the time we reach the 20th century, all of this is ripe and ready to hit. And between the years of 1903 and 1913, we have one art movement after another. We have Fauvism, Cubism, Futurism, Constructivism, Suprematism, De Broca, the Blue Rider group, Expressionism. We have a whole range of movements that explode. And in that tumultuous period leading up to World War I, you're really going to see modernism come into its own and cross over into the mainstream. Now, next lecture, we're going to actually take a little bit of a trip, and we're going to go across the Atlantic, because so far we've only been talking about what's happening in Europe. And I want to remind you, the academic style didn't go away. There's still lots of people painting in the academic style in the second half of the 19th century. Remember, when we teach 19th century art, what we're really teaching is how did we get to modernism. But the academic style is beginning to be chipped away. In 1890, you have the Independent Salon of the Salon of Independent Artists, known as the Fall Salon, the Salon Automne, and it comes and you start to see that this is having an impact. You start to see that the pendulum is starting to swing into the favor of the modernists, and to the point where by the early 20th century, no one can ignore the modernists anymore, and it's the modernists who are going to carry us forward past World War I. In fact, World War I actually kind of accelerates modernism. And we haven't talked about what's happened in America. America has a very different story. America is separated from Europe by a very big ocean, which you couldn't cross by plane because they hadn't been invented yet. You could only cross it by a steamer boat, which took weeks, which means that transmissions of ideas were very slow. So America is going to be much more traditional, at least for a little while. And it's going to go through its own avant-garde movement, which is going to be a social realist movement, which is the Ashcan school. It's going to be the kind of counterpoint to the avant-garde stuff that's happening in Europe. And eventually, these two things are going to crash together, and all of this is going to come to a head at the thing we call the Armory Show in 1913, when all of these crazy innovations of European art are going to be brought over to America, and this is the moment where America really enters the fore of modern art. And because of some accidents of history, like World War I and World War II, ends up being the benefactor of all of these innovations and becomes the center of the art world. But that's a lot to unpack, and we'll save that for the next lecture. See you then. Bye-bye.